The candlestick slipped from Henry Whitfield's coat before he even reached the garden gate, and the sound it made against the cobblestones was louder than any scream. 2 footmen were on him before he could run. They pinned his arms behind his back while he twisted and begged, his voice cracking with panic, and from the study window above, a man watched the whole scene unfold with a stillness that unsettled everyone in the house. The Duke of Ashcombe did not move from the window until the footman dragged Henry Whitfield up the front steps of the manor, his pockets heavy with silver and gold plate that had been locked away not an hour before. Duke Edmund Ashworth had built a reputation on patience, on never raising his voice, on letting other men reveal themselves through their own foolishness. Tonight, foolishness had walked straight into his home. "Bring him to the study," Edmund said quietly, and the words were enough to make the housekeeper flinch. Henry Whitfield was thrown into a chair across from the Duke's desk, his wrists still bound loosely with a length of drapery cord one of the footmen had grabbed in haste. He was a thin man, older than his frame suggested, with the kind of desperation in his eyes that came from years of running from something rather than toward it. "Please," Henry said, before the Duke had even spoken. "I have a family, a daughter. I did not mean—" "You did not mean to steal from me," Edmund said, finishing the sentence with a flatness that made Henry stop breathing for a moment. "And yet here you are, in my study, with my silver in your coat." Henry's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer that would not sound like a lie, because it would be one. Edmund walked around the desk slowly, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, and stopped in front of the trembling man. He studied him the way he studied a contract before signing it, looking for the details that mattered. "Whitfield," Edmund said, testing the name on his tongue. "That is your name." "Yes, your grace." Something shifted behind the Duke's eyes, so briefly that Henry did not notice it, but the housekeeper standing near the door did, and she took an instinctive step back. "You have a daughter, you said." Edmund's voice had changed, though only slightly. Colder, perhaps, or more careful. "How many children do you have, Whitfield?" "2, your grace, a son and a daughter." "Your daughter's name?" Henry blinked, confused by the sudden shift in questioning, uncertain whether answering honestly would help him or make things worse. "Margaret, your grace, though she has gone by Eleanor these past years. Eleanor Grant." The room went very quiet. Edmund did not answer right away. He turned instead and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden where the theft had nearly succeeded, and for a long moment it seemed he had forgotten the man sitting behind him entirely. 6 years. 6 years since a young woman with soft brown eyes and a laugh that filled empty rooms had vanished from his life, without a single word of goodbye. 6 years since he had been told, through a letter delivered by a stranger, that she had chosen another man and wished never to see him again. 6 years of believing a lie that had apparently been paid for with his own family's money, though he had not known that detail until this very moment. He had searched for her in the beginning, quietly, carefully, the way a man searches for something he is ashamed to admit he still wants. He had hired men to ask after a Margaret Whitfield in every county within 2 days' ride, and found nothing, because she had not been using that name. "Eleanor Grant," Edmund repeated, turning back to face Henry. "And where does Eleanor Grant live now?" Henry's fear deepened, though he could not have said why this question frightened him more than the theft itself. "In the cottage past the mill, your grace, with her mother and her brother. She does not know I came here tonight. She believes I am visiting my sister in the next town." "Does she know why you needed money badly enough to steal it?" Henry's silence answered for him. Edmund studied the broken man in front of him, and something colder than anger settled into his chest, not for the theft. He could forgive a man for desperation, even if he could not forgive him for cowardice. What he could not yet forgive, what he did not know if he could ever forgive, was the 6 years this man's choices might have stolen from someone else entirely. "You will remain here tonight," Edmund said. "Under guard but unharmed. I have not decided what will become of you. Your grace, please, if you would only let me explain." "You will have your chance to explain," Edmund said, already moving toward the door. "But not to me, not yet." He left Henry Whitfield sitting in the study, bound and confused, and called for his carriage to be readied before the sun had fully set. The cottage past the mill was smaller than Edmund remembered such places being, though he supposed 6 years changed a man's sense of scale as much as it changed everything else. He stood outside the low fence for a long moment before he could make himself open the gate, his heart behaving in a way it had not behaved since he was a boy of 20, foolish enough to believe love was a simple thing. A woman answered the door before he could knock, drawn perhaps by the sound of an unfamiliar carriage on a quiet road, and when the candlelight from inside the cottage fell across her face, Edmund forgot every careful word he had planned to say. She was older, of course. 6 years does that. Her hair was pinned back more simply than it once had been, and there were small lines near her eyes that had not existed before, earned from work rather than laughter. But her eyes were the same, wide and startled and impossibly familiar, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Margaret," Edmund said finally, though the name felt strange in his mouth after so long. The woman in the doorway went pale. "No one has called me that name in 6 years. "Eleanor, then," he said, correcting himself, though the correction cost him something. She gripped the edge of the door as though she needed it to remain standing. "Your Grace, what are you doing here?" "Your father is at my estate," Edmund said, watching her carefully for every small reaction. "He was caught tonight, stealing from my household." The color that had drained from her face returned all at once, flooding her cheeks with a mixture of shame and fear that Edmund recognized because he had felt something similar 6 years ago, standing in an empty garden with a letter in his hand that told him the woman he loved wanted nothing more to do with him. "Stealing," Eleanor repeated, as though the word did not make sense arranged that way. "He told me he was visiting his sister. He was not." She stepped back from the door, one hand pressed to her chest, and for a moment Edmund thought she might close it entirely, might shut him out the way she had shut him out 6 years before, without explanation, without mercy. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured him in, her hand trembling slightly. "You had better come inside, Your Grace," she said quietly. "It seems there is a great deal we both do not know." The cottage was modest but clean, a fire burning low in the hearth, and Edmund noticed a boy of perhaps 15 watching from a doorway with wide, cautious eyes before Eleanor sent him upstairs with a gentle but firm word. When they were alone, she gestured to a chair near the fire, though she herself remained standing, arms wrapped around herself as though bracing for a blow. "Tell me what happened," Edmund said. "Tell me everything." "I do not know what my father has done tonight," she said, "but I can guess why. We have owed money to men who do not forgive debts easily. For longer than I care to admit, my father has always believed that one desperate act would solve what a lifetime of small ones could not." Edmund absorbed this in silence, watching the firelight move across her face, searching for the girl he had known, and finding instead a woman who had clearly survived a great deal alone. "6 years ago," he said slowly, "I received a letter. It told me you had chosen to marry another man, and that you wished me to forget you entirely. It was signed with your name, though I never received a single word from you afterward to confirm it." Eleanor's arms tightened around herself. "I never wrote such a letter, Your Grace. I never chose another man. I was told that you had grown tired of me, that your family had arranged a match with a woman of proper standing, and that continuing to see me would only bring shame upon us both." The silence between them stretched long enough that the fire popped twice before either spoke again. "Who told you that?" Edmund asked, though some cold part of him had already begun to suspect the answer. Eleanor's eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw the same dawning horror that was building in his own chest. "My father," she whispered. "My father told me." Edmund closed his eyes briefly. 6 years of quiet grief rearranging itself into something far uglier, far more deliberate than heartbreak. Somewhere in his own home, under guard in his own study, sat the man who had apparently sold both their futures for a price neither of them had ever agreed to pay. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice barely steady, "what is going to happen to my father?" Edmund looked at her for a long moment, torn between the fury building in his chest and the strange, aching relief of finally understanding what had happened 6 years ago, of finally knowing that he had not been abandoned after all, only stolen from, in the cruelest way a man could be robbed. "That," he said quietly, "depends a great deal on what else your father has been hiding from both of us." Eleanor sank into the chair he had refused earlier, her legs no longer willing to hold her upright. The fire cast long shadows across the small room, and for a moment the only sound was the soft crackle of burning wood and the distant creak of her brother's footsteps upstairs, pausing near the top of the stairs as though he too were listening. 6 years, she said, more to herself than to him. 6 years I believed you had simply stopped wanting me. I built an entire life around that belief. I changed my name so that no one from my old life would ever find me, and see how far I had fallen. I told myself it did not matter, that a duke could never truly have loved a girl with no fortune and no name worth mentioning. "I searched for you," Edmund said, the words rougher than he intended. "For months, I searched. I hired men to look in every town within 2 days of London. I never once thought to look for a woman named Eleanor Grant, because no such woman existed in my mind. I was looking for Margaret Whitfield, and she had vanished as though she had never lived at all. She had to vanish, Eleanor said quietly. My father insisted upon it. He said if anyone from your world learned who I truly was, it would ruin whatever chance remained of us starting over quietly, away from scandal. Edmund's jaw tightened. Every explanation only deepened the wound rather than closing it. He rose from his chair and moved toward the small window, staring out at the dark shape of the mill beyond the trees, trying to steady the anger rising in his chest before he spoke again. None of what your father told either of us was true, he said finally. Not the letter, not the reasons for your silence, not the story he gave you about my family's arrangements. He built two separate lies and gave one to each of us, and for 6 years, we both believed him. Eleanor said nothing, but he heard the small, broken sound she made, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, the sound of a person realizing just how much of her life had been shaped by someone else's carefully constructed deception. I do not know what to feel, she admitted. Relief, that you did not simply stop loving me. Fury, that 6 years were taken from us both, without either of us having any say in the matter. You are allowed to feel both, Edmund said, turning back to face her. I certainly do. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters gently, and somewhere in the dark a dog barked once and fell silent again. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, composing herself the way a woman who had spent years surviving without help learned to do quickly, out of necessity rather than choice. What happens now? She asked again, and this time her voice held less fear and more determination, as though she had decided, in the space of a single conversation, that she would not simply wait to be told her own fate. Edmund looked at her for a long moment, the woman his heart had never quite let go of despite 6 years of silence, and felt the shape of a decision beginning to form, though he was not yet ready to say it aloud. Now, he said, we find out exactly how far your father's lies reached, and what it will cost to undo them. Henry Whitfield had not slept, though the guest room he had been placed in, against all reason, was finer than any room he had ever occupied in his life. He sat on the edge of the bed with the drapery cord still marked into his wrists, and listened to the sound of a carriage returning to the estate just before dawn. He knew before the door opened who would be standing on the other side of it. Edmund entered without knocking, his coat still damp from the night air, his expression carved from something far colder than the fury Henry had expected. Behind him, unannounced, stood Eleanor, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, her chin lifted despite the exhaustion clear in her eyes. Margaret, Henry breathed, using the name he had always called her, his relief at seeing her quickly curdling into dread when he saw the look on her face. Do not call me that, she said quietly. Not until you have explained why you told a man I loved that I no longer wanted him, and told me the same lie in reverse. Henry's face went the color of old ash. His mouth worked silently for a moment before any sound came out. Margaret, please, I can explain. Then explain, Edmund said, his voice low and dangerously even. Explain to your daughter why you took payment from my own family steward to end an engagement that had never once been discussed with him. Explain why you told her I had abandoned her for a woman of higher standing, when no such woman ever existed. The room went silent except for the sound of Henry's breathing, ragged and uneven. You do not understand what those years were like, Henry finally said, his voice cracking. Your father, Your Grace, may his memory rest as it deserves, made it very clear to me what would happen to my family if the match continued. He offered money, yes, but he also made threats. He said he would see my business ruined, my family cast out of every respectable house in the county, if I did not end things quietly. Edmund's expression did not soften, though something in his eyes flickered with an old, familiar grief. His father had died 3 years ago, and in all that time Edmund had never once suspected the man capable of interfering so directly in his life, of arranging an entire deception behind his back, and paying for its execution. My father is not here to answer for his part in this, Edmund said. You are, and you took his money willingly enough, Whitfield. You did not need threats to write a lie in your own daughter's hand, and deliver it to my door. I forged nothing, Henry said quickly. I paid a woman in town who wrote a fine hand, who did not know Margaret at all, to compose the letter. I only told her what to write. You still wrote the lie, Eleanor said, stepping forward for the first time, her voice shaking with a fury Edmund had not yet seen from her. You still told me his family despised me. You still told me he had chosen someone else. Do you know what that did to me, Father? I stopped believing I deserved to be loved by anyone at all after that. I told myself if a duke could look at me and see nothing worth keeping, then no man ever would. Henry flinched as though she had struck him, and perhaps in a way she had. I did it to protect you, he said weakly. You did it to protect yourself, Eleanor said. From the Duke's father's threats, yes, but also from the shame of never being able to give me a proper dowry, of never being able to stand beside a Duke's family as an equal. You were not protecting me. You were protecting your own pride. The accusation landed heavier than any Edmund could have made himself, and Henry's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of it. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound like another excuse. Edmund watched the exchange with a strange, tight feeling in his chest, torn between satisfaction at seeing the truth finally surface and discomfort at witnessing a daughter dismantle her father so completely. He had wanted answers. He had not expected to feel sympathy for the broken man in front of him, but some small, unwanted part of him did. There is still the matter of tonight's theft, Edmund said finally, drawing both their attention back to him. Whatever happened 6 years ago, it does not erase what you attempted last night, Whitfield. Henry's head dropped. I know, Your Grace. I will accept whatever punishment you see fit. Why did you need the money so badly? Edmund asked. You have clearly managed to survive these 6 years without turning to theft before now. What changed? Henry hesitated, glancing briefly at Eleanor before answering. There is a man in town, a lender, who has held a debt over my head for the better part of 2 years. I borrowed against the cottage to keep us fed during a hard winter, and the interest has grown faster than I could ever hope to repay it honestly. He gave me until the end of this month before he would see us removed from our home entirely. Eleanor's anger faltered slightly, replaced by something closer to weary familiarity, as though this was not the first time her father's poor decisions had threatened everything they had. You could have told me, she said quietly. We could have found another way. What other way, Margaret? Henry asked, his voice breaking. We have no family left willing to help us. Your mother's health grows worse each season, and the physician's fees alone eat what little I earn. I did not steal because I am a wicked man. I stole because I did not know what else to do. Edmund studied him for a long moment, weighing the desperation in Henry's voice against the calculated cruelty of what he had done 6 years earlier. They were not, he realized slowly, the same kind of crime, even if they had both caused enormous harm. One had been born from fear and pride, the other from genuine desperation, however poorly handled. I could have you arrested this morning, Edmund said. The evidence against you is more than sufficient, and no magistrate in this county would question a duke's word over a common thief's. Henry closed his eyes, bracing for the words that would follow. But I will not do that, Edmund continued, and both Henry and Eleanor looked up at him with matching expressions of surprise. Not yet, because I find myself far more interested in understanding what 6 years of your lies cost your daughter, and what, if anything, can still be salvaged from the wreckage of them. Your Grace, Eleanor said carefully, you owe my father nothing, least of all mercy. I am not offering him mercy for his sake, Edmund said, turning to look at her directly, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. I am offering it because I do not wish to begin whatever comes next between us by sending your father to prison, and leaving your mother and brother without the only means of support they have, however poorly managed that support has been. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, uncertain whether to trust the offer or the man making it, 6 years of guarded self-protection warring with the same feeling that had drawn her to him in the first place. What comes next between us, she repeated slowly. Your Grace, I do not even know what that means. We have known each other again for less than a day. We knew each other for 2 years before that day, Edmund said quietly. And every letter I never received from you, I wrote to you regardless, though I burned each one rather than send it to a woman who I believed no longer wished to hear from me. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly at that admission, her eyes glassy with tears she refused to let fall in front of her father. Henry watched the exchange between them with a growing, uncomfortable awareness that his daughter's future no longer depended solely on the choices he made for her, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt truly afraid, not for himself, but for what he might have already ruined beyond repair. There is a condition, Edmund said, turning back to Henry, his voice hardening again. You will remain under watch here at the estate until I have decided what is to be done about the debt you owe your lender, and about the theft itself. You will not return to your cottage, and you will not attempt to speak with your daughter alone, not until I am satisfied that whatever you say to her will not be another lie built to serve your own ends. Henry nodded quickly, too relieved to argue with terms that felt, to him, remarkably generous given the circumstances. And you, Edmund said, turning to Eleanor, his voice softening, though only slightly, will come with me now, so that we might speak somewhere your father cannot interrupt or influence what either of us chooses to say. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding, and as she followed him from the room, she did not look back at her father, though she felt his eyes on her the entire way, heavy with a guilt 6 years too late to undo the damage it had caused. Outside, the morning light had begun to spread thin and gray across the estate grounds, and Edmund led her not toward the main house but toward the gardens, where 6 years ago, in a different season, they had once walked together believing they had all the time in the world. "I do not know how to trust this," Eleanor admitted as they walked, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the morning chill. "How to trust you, or myself, or anything about the last day, when everything I believed about my own life turned out to be built on a lie my own father told. I do not expect trust to return in a single conversation," Edmund said. "I only ask that you allow the possibility of it, the way I am trying to." Eleanor said nothing for a long while, and the silence between them was not entirely uncomfortable, filled instead with the quiet, careful weight of two people learning, slowly, how to stand beside each other again, after 6 years of believing they never would. They reached a low stone bench beneath a row of bare apple trees, and Edmund gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man trying to hold himself steady. "There was a season," he said, "just after your father's letter arrived, when I could not walk through these gardens at all. I had my steward close off this entire path, because every turn reminded me of something we had once said to each other here. It took me nearly 2 years before I could stand in this spot without feeling as though the ground itself might give way beneath me." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the rawness in his voice, a rawness dukes were rarely permitted to show, even to those closest to them. "I did not know grief could look like that from the outside. I only ever saw my own." "What did your grief look like?" he asked, lowering himself finally onto the far end of the bench, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. "Quiet," she said after a moment. "I did not have the luxury of gardens to avoid or stewards to give orders to. I had a mother whose health was already failing, and a young brother who needed someone steady to look up to. So I folded my grief small enough to carry in my pocket and went on with the business of surviving each day, because there was no other choice available to me." Edmund's jaw tightened at the image her words painted, the contrast between his quiet, private suffering in a grand house full of servants, and hers, carried silently while she raised a younger brother and nursed a mother he had not even known existed until this morning. "I am sorry," he said. "Not only for what my father did, and what yours did, but for every day I spent believing my own pain was the greater one, when clearly it was not." "Grief does not need to be compared to be real," Eleanor said gently, some of the sharpness from earlier softening now that they were away from her father's presence. "You lost something too, Your Grace." "I do not begrudge you that." They sat together in silence for a while, watching a pair of sparrows dart between the bare branches above them, and slowly, without either of them fully deciding to allow it, the space between them on the bench seemed to shrink, inch by careful inch, until their shoulders nearly touched. "What will you do about my father?" Eleanor asked eventually, breaking the quiet. "I have not fully decided," Edmund admitted. "Part of me wants to see him held accountable for every year he stole from us both. But another part recognizes that punishing him further will do little to give either of us back the time we lost, and it would certainly not help your mother or your brother, who bear no responsibility for any of this." "You are kinder than I expected a duke to be," Eleanor said, something like the ghost of her old fondness for him flickering behind her eyes. "I am not certain it is kindness," Edmund said honestly. "I think perhaps I simply cannot bring myself to cause you further pain, even through your father, when I have only just been given the chance to stand near you again." Eleanor's breath caught softly at the admission, and for the first time since he had appeared at her cottage door the night before, she allowed herself to look at him not as the duke whose family had once threatened her father, nor as the man whose letter had shattered her heart, but simply as Edmund, the person she had loved before either of them understood how easily love could be stolen by someone else's fear. "I do not know what I want from any of this," she admitted quietly. "Whether I want my father punished or forgiven, whether I want to trust you again or protect myself from ever being hurt this way twice, I only know that sitting here, beside you, feels less impossible than it did yesterday." "That is enough for now," Edmund said. "We do not need to solve everything in a single morning." The sparrows scattered suddenly overhead, startled by some unseen movement near the hedges, and both of them turned instinctively toward the sound, the fragile peace of the moment reminding them both that whatever had begun to mend between them remained, for now, surrounded on all sides by unresolved danger. The lender arrived at the estate gates 3 days later, uninvited and unannounced, demanding to speak with whoever now claimed responsibility for Henry Whitfield's debts. His name was Mr. Colton, a thin, sharp-eyed man with a ledger tucked permanently beneath one arm, and when the estate's own steward, a different Mr. Colton entirely by coincidence of common surnames, tried to turn him away at the gate, the lender simply raised his voice loud enough to be heard from the front steps of the house. "I know the thief is being sheltered here," he called out. "I know a duke's name now stands somewhere near this debt, and I intend to see it paid, one way or another." Edmund heard the commotion from his study window, and came down himself, rather than send a servant to manage what was clearly a man determined to be difficult. Eleanor, who had been staying in a guest wing of the estate at Edmund's insistence, appeared in the front hall moments later, drawn by the sound of raised voices, her face paling when she recognized the lender's ledger. "That is him," she whispered to Edmund as he passed her in the hall. "That is the man who holds my father's debt." Edmund nodded once, his expression settling into the calm, unreadable mask he wore for business he did not intend to lose, and stepped outside to meet the lender directly. "You have business with my household," Edmund said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. The lender's confidence faltered slightly upon realizing he stood before the Duke himself rather than a steward, but he recovered quickly, straightening his coat and lifting his ledger as though it were evidence in a courtroom. "Your Grace, I apologize for the disturbance, but Henry Whitfield owes me a considerable sum, and I have reason to believe he has been sheltering here these past several days, rather than facing his obligations." "He has been here," Edmund confirmed, "under my supervision, following an incident involving property belonging to this estate." The lender's eyebrows rose with poorly concealed interest. "An incident, Your Grace? That is not your concern," Edmund said flatly. "What is your concern is the debt itself. State the sum, in full, including whatever interest you have accumulated." The lender named a figure that made Eleanor's breath catch where she stood watching from the doorway, a number far larger than she had imagined, larger certainly than her father had ever admitted to her. "That is an extraordinary amount for a modest loan against a small cottage," Edmund said, his voice cooling several more degrees. "I would like to see the original terms of this loan, Mr. Colton, along with a full accounting of how the sum grew so significantly in only 2 years. The lender hesitated, and in that hesitation, Edmund found his answer. "You have been charging interest well beyond what any honest lender would consider fair," Edmund said. "I have dealt with enough merchants and moneylenders in my life to recognize a predatory arrangement when I see the numbers laid out before me." "Your Grace, I conducted my business entirely within the bounds of the law," the lender said quickly, though sweat had begun to bead along his hairline despite the cool morning air. "Perhaps," Edmund said, "or perhaps you counted on a desperate man never having the means or the standing to challenge your terms. That calculation, Mr. Colton, no longer applies, given whose household you have chosen to bring your ledger into." The lender's composure cracked visibly now, his eyes darting toward the ledger in his hands as though searching for some figure that might save him from the conversation he now found himself trapped inside. "I will pay the original sum you loaned to Henry Whitfield," Edmund said, "calculated with reasonable interest, as any fair court in this county would assess it. Not the figure you have quoted me today, which I suspect would not survive scrutiny from a magistrate." "Your Grace, I cannot simply forgive." "I am not asking you to forgive anything," Edmund interrupted. "I am telling you what I am willing to pay, and I am reminding you that I have considerable standing in this county, standing which could be turned toward investigating your lending practices rather generously, should you choose to argue with me further." The threat, delivered in the same calm tone Edmund used for every other sentence, landed with far more weight than any shout could have managed. The lender's shoulders sagged, the fight draining visibly out of him as he recalculated, in real time, the cost of continuing to argue with a duke who held more power in this county than any magistrate the lender might have appealed to. "The original sum with reasonable interest would be acceptable, Your Grace," the lender said quietly. "Good," Edmund said. "My steward will handle the payment this afternoon. You will sign documentation confirming the debt is settled in full, and you will have no further business with the Whitfield family after today." The lender nodded quickly, eager now to leave before the Duke reconsidered his generosity, and within the hour the matter was settled, the debt paid, the ledger updated and signed, the threat that had driven Henry Whitfield to theft dissolved as quickly and completely as morning fog beneath a rising sun. Eleanor found Edmund alone in his study afterward, staring at nothing in particular, his hands braced against the edge of his desk. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly from the doorway. "I know," Edmund said, without turning around. "Then why did you?" He turned to face her then, and the exhaustion in his eyes surprised her, as though settling the debt had cost him something beyond the money itself. Because watching your father tremble in front of that man reminded me of watching you tremble in your own doorway 3 nights ago, and I found I could not bear to let that particular fear continue in either of you, regardless of what your father may have done to deserve some measure of consequence. Eleanor crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair her father had occupied that first terrible night. My father does not deserve this kindness, Your Grace. Not after everything. Perhaps not, Edmund agreed, but I did not settle that debt for your father's sake. I settled it because I could not stand the thought of you carrying that weight any longer than you already have. Something in Eleanor's chest loosened at the admission, a tightness she had carried for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. I do not know how to repay a kindness like that. You do not need to repay it, Edmund said. I did not offer it as a transaction. They sat together for a long moment, the study quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of servants going about the ordinary business of the house, and Eleanor found herself studying his face the way she once had, years ago, when the future had still seemed simple and certain. May I ask you something, Your Grace? She said finally. Edmund, he corrected gently, please. After everything, I think we have earned the right to first names, at least when we are alone. Edmund, she said, testing the name the way he had tested her old one days before. Why did you never marry, in all these years? A man in your position must have faced no shortage of suitable matches. He was quiet for a moment, considering how honestly to answer. I told myself for the first 2 years that I simply had not found the right match among the women my family introduced me to. By the 3rd year, I stopped pretending that was the reason. I think some part of me always knew I was comparing every woman I met to a memory I had convinced myself I needed to forget. Eleanor's eyes glistened slightly, though she blinked the feeling back before it could fully surface. I told myself something similar, though my reasons were less noble. I told myself no honest man would want a wife whose own father had proven himself untrustworthy, so I stopped allowing myself to be courted at all, for fear of what any suitor might eventually discover about my family. Your father's failures were never yours to carry, Edmund said. Perhaps not, Eleanor said, but they became mine to carry regardless, the way children so often inherit the consequences of their parents' choices, whether they deserve to or not. Edmund rose from his chair and moved around the desk, kneeling briefly beside hers so that their eyes met at the same level, an act of humility that startled her given his station. I cannot undo the 6 years your father's choices cost us. I cannot promise the road ahead will be simple, especially once society learns the full story of how we came to be reunited, but I can promise that whatever choices remain to be made from this point forward, I intend to make them honestly, and I intend to make them with you, if you will allow it. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the careful deception her father had shown her for years, and found instead only the same steady sincerity she remembered from before, tempered now by 6 years of loss that had clearly changed him as much as it had changed her. I do not know if I am ready to trust so completely, so quickly, she admitted, but I am willing to try, Edmund. I think, after everything, that is the most honest answer I can give you. It is more than enough, he said quietly. And for the first time since she had opened her cottage door 3 nights before, Eleanor allowed herself a small, genuine smile, fragile but real, the first hopeful thing she had felt in longer than she cared to admit. Outside the study window, the afternoon light had begun to shift golden across the estate grounds, and somewhere in the house, Henry Whitfield sat alone in his guest room, unaware that the debt threatening to destroy his family had already been quietly resolved, unaware that his daughter and the Duke he had once paid to separate were, slowly and carefully, finding their way back toward each other, despite everything he had done to prevent it. But not everyone in the county would greet this reunion so gently, and word of a duke's sudden, curious interest in a thief's daughter had already begun to travel faster than either Edmund or Eleanor could have anticipated, carried on the eager tongues of servants and neighbors alike, toward ears that would not receive the news kindly. That evening, Eleanor asked Edmund's permission to send for her brother, explaining that Peter had been alone at the cottage with only their ailing mother for company these past several days, and that she worried for how he might be managing without either parent present. Edmund agreed at once, sending his own carriage to fetch the boy, and by nightfall Peter arrived at the estate, wide-eyed and uncertain, clutching a small bundle of his own belongings as though he expected to be sent away again at any moment. He was 15, tall for his age but still carrying the awkward angles of boyhood, and he watched Edmund with a wariness that reminded Eleanor painfully of herself at that age, always braced for disappointment before it arrived. "You are the Duke," Peter said, more statement than question, once he had been shown into the small parlor where Eleanor waited for him. "I am," Edmund said, "and you must be Peter. Your sister has spoken of you." Peter glanced at Eleanor, uncertain how much to say in front of a man whose household his father had tried to rob only days before. His father truly here? The neighbors are saying he was arrested. "He is here," Eleanor said gently, guiding her brother to sit beside her. "He was not arrested. His grace has been far more generous than father deserves." Peter's expression flickered with something complicated. Relief and resentment tangled together in a way only a child who had grown up too fast could manage. "Is that why we owe no more money to that awful man who came to the cottage last winter, shouting until mother cried?" Edmund's expression darkened slightly at the mention of the lender's earlier visits to the cottage, details Eleanor had not fully shared with him. "That debt has been settled, Peter. You need not worry about that man returning again." Peter studied Edmund for a long moment, the wariness in his young face slowly giving way to something more tentative and hopeful. "Mother always said the Duke who courted Margaret years ago was the kindest man she had ever met, before father told us he had abandoned her. I did not know what to believe, since I was too young to remember much of it myself." "Your mother remembered correctly," Edmund said quietly. "I never abandoned your sister. I was told a lie, the same lie your father told her, and it kept us apart for 6 years neither of us wished to lose." Peter absorbed this information with the particular seriousness of a boy accustomed to piecing together adult secrets from half-heard conversations and careful silences. "Father lied to both of you?" "He did," Eleanor said, deciding there was no kindness left in shielding her brother from a truth he was clearly old enough to understand. "He believed he was protecting our family, though the cost of that protection fell heaviest on people who never agreed to pay it." Peter was quiet for a while, staring at his hands, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its youthful uncertainty. "I am glad the debt is settled. I am glad Mother will not have to worry anymore about strange men coming to our door. But I do not think I know how to forgive Father for what he did to you, even if you find a way to forgive him yourself." "You do not have to forgive him on my behalf," Eleanor said, pulling her brother into a brief, tight embrace. "You are allowed to feel whatever you feel about all of this, exactly as I have allowed myself to feel it." Edmund watched the exchange between brother and sister with a quiet ache in his chest, struck by how much responsibility this family had carried alone for years, how much weight had settled onto shoulders far too young and too tired to bear it without help. He resolved in that moment that whatever else came from the tangled mess of Henry Whitfield's choices, this boy would not grow up believing that kindness and honesty were rare enough to be treasured only in memory. "You are welcome to stay here at the estate for as long as your family requires," Edmund said. "Your mother as well, once she is well enough to travel. There is more than enough room, and I would rather know all of you are safe and comfortable than continue worrying about a cottage too small to properly shelter you all." Peter's eyes widened at the offer, glancing quickly toward his sister for guidance on how to respond to such generosity from a man he had known for less than an hour. "That is very kind, Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, "but I would not wish to impose further upon your household, especially given how complicated matters already stand between our families." "It would not be an imposition," Edmund said, "and I suspect, given how quickly word travels in this county, that complications are already spreading well beyond what either of us can control from here. I would rather your family be somewhere safe and watched over while that unfolds, rather than alone in a cottage with no one to help should trouble arrive at your door instead of mine." Eleanor considered this, recognizing the practical wisdom beneath his generosity, and after a moment she nodded. "Then we accept, Edmund. Thank you." Peter looked between them, sensing something unspoken passing in the exchange, something that went beyond simple hospitality, and though he was young, he was not foolish, and he began, slowly, to understand that his sister's future, and this quiet, careful Duke's future, had become tangled together in a way that no lie, however carefully constructed, would easily unravel again. Later that night, after Peter had been shown to a room of his own and Eleanor had gone to check on him one final time before retiring, Edmund stood alone in his study once more, staring at the same window from which he had first watched Henry Whitfield dragged toward the house days before. So much had shifted in so short a time, and yet he could feel, even now, the weight of everything still unresolved pressing against the fragile peace they had managed to build. Society would not simply accept a duke's sudden attachment to a family shadowed by theft and scandal, however unfair the true circumstances proved to be, and somewhere beyond these walls, tongues were already beginning to wag with a version of events far less generous than the truth. Lord Pelham arrived at the estate uninvited, exactly 9 days after Henry Whitfield had been caught with silver in his coat, and his smile carried the particular sharpness of a man who had come not to visit, but to observe. "Ashcombe," he said warmly, clasping Edmund's hand in the entrance hall, as though they were old friends, rather than distant rivals, who had spent years competing quietly for standing within the county's tightest social circles. "I heard the most remarkable rumor and simply had to see for myself whether there was any truth to it." "What rumor might that be, Pelham?" Edmund asked, his tone carefully neutral, though he already suspected the answer. "That you have taken in an entire family," Pelham said, his eyes glittering with poorly concealed delight, "including, if the servants are to be believed, the very thief who was caught stealing from your own household not 2 weeks past, and his daughter, apparently, occupies rather more of your attention than one might expect from a simple act of charity." Edmund's expression remained unreadable, though inwardly he cursed the speed with which household gossip had clearly traveled beyond his own walls. "You have always had a talent for collecting stories, Pelham, though rarely an equal talent for verifying them before repeating them at dinner parties." Pelham laughed, unbothered by the barb. "Come now, Ashcombe. I mean no offense. I am simply curious, as I imagine half the county now is. What exactly has captured your interest so thoroughly that you would shelter a criminal's entire family beneath your own roof?" Before Edmund could answer, Eleanor appeared at the top of the staircase, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar voice, and Pelham's gaze shifted immediately toward her, sharp and assessing, in a way that made Edmund's jaw tighten. "Ah," Pelham said softly, "there she is. I must say, Ashcombe, I can see why she has captured your attention. Though I confess I am curious whether her father's crimes trouble you as little as they seem to, or whether you have simply decided her charms outweigh such inconvenient details." "That is quite enough, Pelham," Edmund said, his voice dropping into a register that made even Pelham's confident smile falter slightly. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, composing herself with the same careful dignity she had learned to summon during years of quiet survival, and stopped beside Edmund with her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the visiting lord's scrutiny. "My father's crimes are between him and his grace," she said evenly. "I do not believe they are any business of yours, Lord Pelham." Pelham's eyebrows rose, clearly surprised by her composure, though his smile did not fully disappear. "Spoken like a woman with something to hide, Miss Whitfield. Or is it Miss Grant these days? I confess the servants' gossip has grown rather tangled on that particular detail." "It is Whitfield," Eleanor said firmly. "I see no reason to continue hiding behind a name I only adopted because my father's lies made it necessary." "How refreshingly honest," Pelham said, though his tone suggested he found the honesty less charming than he claimed. "I do wonder, however, how the rest of society will receive such honesty, once word spreads properly beyond this estate's walls. Dukes are permitted their eccentricities, of course, but even eccentricity has its limits when it comes to matters of family and standing." "Is there a purpose to this visit, Pelham?" Edmund said, beyond delivering thinly veiled threats disguised as concern. Pelham's smile widened, unbothered by the accusation. "No threat intended, Ashcombe, merely observation, though I will admit, I had hoped to discuss a rather different matter with you today, one that now seems considerably less likely to interest you given present circumstances." "What matter?" Edmund asked warily. "My sister," Pelham said. "Lady Charlotte has recently come of age, and our family had hoped a match between our two houses might finally be arranged, given how long our families have circled the possibility without ever quite committing to it. I see now, however, that your attention has clearly settled elsewhere, however unsuitable that attention might prove to be." Edmund's expression hardened further. "I never gave your family any indication such an arrangement was under serious consideration, Pelham. Perhaps not explicitly," Pelham said, "but expectations have a way of forming regardless, particularly among families who have watched each other's fortunes for as long as ours have. I simply thought you should know that abandoning such an arrangement in favor of a thief's daughter will not go unnoticed, nor uncommented upon, by those who matter most in circles you still depend upon for influence and standing." Eleanor felt the weight of the threat settle over her, heavier than anything Pelham had said directly, and she glanced at Edmund, uncertain whether the pressure of society's judgment might eventually prove stronger than whatever fragile trust they had begun rebuilding between them. "I appreciate your concern for my reputation, Pelham," Edmund said coolly, "though I have managed my own affairs successfully enough these past several years without your guidance. I will continue to do so now." Pelham studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he had arrived with, before offering a final, thin smile. "Very well, Ashcombe. I only hope, for your sake, that whatever you have found in Miss Whitfield proves worth the cost of what you stand to lose by choosing her so publicly. He took his leave shortly after, and once the sound of his carriage had faded down the drive, Eleanor turned to Edmund with a troubled expression she could not fully hide. "He is right, in a way," she said quietly. "Choosing me publicly will cost you standing you have spent years building. I do not wish to be the reason your reputation suffers, Edmund, especially not after everything you have already sacrificed to help my family." "My reputation has survived worse than gossip," Edmund said, though the tightness in his voice suggested Pelham's visit had unsettled him more than he wished to admit. "What concerns me more is how quickly this story is spreading, and how much of it has already been twisted beyond recognition by the time it reaches ears like Pelham's." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "I mean that Pelham did not learn these details from careful investigation," Edmund said. "He learned them from servants' gossip, which means the story is already traveling far beyond anything either of us can easily correct. By the time it reaches London, I suspect the tale will bear little resemblance to the truth of what actually happened between us." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the thought. "And what happens then? If society decides the story, whatever version reaches them, is scandal enough to matter? Then we will need to decide, together, how much we are willing to risk in order to remain honest about what happened, rather than allowing rumor to write our story for us," Edmund said. That evening, as Eleanor sat with her brother in the small parlor they had begun to think of as their own corner of the estate, she found herself turning Pelham's words over again and again, unable to fully shake the fear that whatever fragile happiness she had begun to allow herself might yet be undone by forces entirely outside her control. Peter noticed her distraction and asked what troubled her, and though she tried to reassure him, she could not quite keep the worry from her voice. Meanwhile, in a separate wing of the estate, Henry Whitfield sat alone with his own thoughts, having overheard enough of Pelham's visit through an open window to understand the shape of the danger now circling his daughter. And for the first time since his crime had first been discovered, he began to consider whether there was some way, however small, that he might yet act to protect her, rather than continue being the source of every danger she now faced. The following morning, Henry requested an audience with Edmund, a request that surprised the Duke enough that he granted it despite his lingering distrust of the man. Henry entered the study slowly, no longer bound, though his posture still carried the stooped caution of a man unaccustomed to being received as anything other than a burden. "Your Grace," Henry began, "I overheard enough of Lord Pelham's visit yesterday to understand the trouble my presence continues to cause for my daughter, even now, weeks after the theft itself." "Your presence is not the trouble, Whitfield," Edmund said carefully. "The trouble is the story society has begun to tell about all of us, one that grows less accurate with every retelling." "Perhaps," Henry said, "but I know my own part in creating that story has not helped matters. If I had never taken your family's money 6 years ago, if I had never lied to either you or my daughter, there would be no scandal for Pelham to circle now like a hawk over wounded prey." Edmund studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation he had come to expect from Henry Whitfield, but found instead something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine remorse. "What are you suggesting, Whitfield?" "I am suggesting that I owe my daughter more than simple silence and gratitude for the mercy you have shown my family," Henry said. "I am suggesting that perhaps it is time I stopped hiding from the consequences of my own choices and started taking some responsibility for repairing what I broke, rather than leaving that burden entirely upon you and Margaret both." "What did you have in mind?" Edmund asked, though he remained wary. "I do not yet know," Henry admitted, "but I would ask your permission to speak with my daughter properly, without you present this time, so that I might offer her the apology I owe her directly, rather than continuing to let her anger toward me simmer unaddressed beneath everything else happening around her." Edmund considered the request for a long moment. He had promised Eleanor he would not allow her father to manipulate her further, and he was not yet fully convinced that Henry's sudden humility was entirely free of self-interest. And yet something in the older man's posture, the genuine weariness in his voice, suggested this was not simply another performance calculated to win back favor. "I will allow it," Edmund said finally, "but only if Eleanor herself agrees to the conversation. I will not force her to hear an apology she is not yet ready to receive." Henry nodded, grateful for even this conditional permission. "That is more than fair, Your Grace. Thank you." When Edmund relayed the request to Eleanor later that afternoon, she was quiet for a long time before answering, turning the offer over carefully in her mind. Peter, who had been sitting nearby working through a lesson book Edmund's tutor had provided him, watched his sister's face with the same careful attention he had learned to pay to every shift in the household's fragile peace. "I do not know if I am ready to hear an apology from him," Eleanor admitted finally. Part of me fears that hearing it will only reopen wounds I have only just begun to let heal. You do not have to agree, Edmund reminded her gently. Your father's need to apologize does not obligate you to accept that apology on his timeline rather than your own. I know, Eleanor said, but I also know that avoiding him forever will not make the anger disappear. It will simply bury it somewhere deeper, the way I buried my grief for 6 years, until it becomes something I can no longer control. She agreed, eventually, to a brief conversation, held in the same small parlor where Peter had first met Edmund, with the door left open, and Edmund waiting close enough to intervene should the conversation turn cruel rather than honest. Henry entered slowly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, and sat across from his daughter with none of the confidence that had once defined him before his crimes had stripped it away entirely. Margaret, he began, then stopped himself. Eleanor, I do not expect you to forgive me today, or perhaps ever, but I need you to know that I understand, finally, the true weight of what I took from you. Not simply 6 years of happiness, but 6 years of believing yourself unworthy of the love you deserved. That is a wound I gave you, and no apology I offer now can fully undo it. Eleanor listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, searching his face for any sign of the old manipulation she had learned to recognize so easily over the years. She found, instead, only exhaustion and genuine sorrow, the look of a man who had finally run out of excuses to hide behind. I do not forgive you, she said quietly, when he had finished. Not yet, perhaps not for a long while still, but I hear you, Father. And I am willing to let that be enough, for now, rather than continuing to carry this particular weight between us unspoken. Henry nodded, tears gathering in his eyes that he made no attempt to hide. That is more than I deserve, and more than enough for me to begin trying to earn something better in the time I have left to try. The conversation ended there, brief but significant, and though it resolved nothing fully, it marked the first honest exchange between father and daughter in longer than either of them could easily remember, a small, fragile step toward something that might, eventually, resemble healing. The invitation arrived on cream paper edged in gold, and Eleanor knew, the moment she saw the seal, that whatever quiet peace the estate had offered her these past weeks was about to be tested in front of an audience far less forgiving than her father or her brother. Lady Pelham was hosting a gathering, ostensibly to celebrate the arrival of spring, though everyone in the county understood the true purpose of such events was to observe, judge, and discuss whatever scandal currently occupied polite conversation. And this season, Eleanor knew without needing to be told, that scandal was her. You do not have to attend, Edmund said, watching her study the invitation with a troubled expression. I can send our regrets easily enough. If we refuse, they will simply assume the rumors are true and that we are hiding from them, Eleanor said. If we attend, at least we control what they see with their own eyes, rather than only what they hear secondhand. Edmund studied her for a long moment, admiring the steady courage beneath her nervousness, the same quiet strength that had carried her through 6 years of hardship without breaking entirely. Are you certain? No, Eleanor admitted, but I am tired of hiding, Edmund. I hid for 6 years because I believed I had no right to be seen, no right to claim a place in your world. I do not wish to spend the rest of whatever time we have together hiding still. They arrived at the Pelham estate 3 evenings later, and the moment they entered the ballroom, Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift toward them, conversations pausing mid-sentence, fans lifting to conceal whispered speculation behind painted silk. She kept her chin lifted and her hand steady on Edmund's arm, refusing to let the weight of so much scrutiny bend her posture even slightly. Lady Charlotte, Pelham's sister, approached first, her smile polite but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Miss Whitfield, she said, emphasizing the name deliberately. How wonderful that you could join us this evening. I confess I have heard so much about you these past weeks that I hardly knew what to expect. I imagine much of what you have heard bears little resemblance to the truth, Eleanor said evenly, refusing to let the veiled insult unsettle her. I would be happy to correct any details you find yourself curious about, Lady Charlotte, rather than continue relying on second-hand gossip. Charlotte's smile faltered slightly, clearly unprepared for such direct confidence from a woman she had expected to find cowed by the occasion. How refreshingly bold of you, she said, recovering quickly. Though I wonder if boldness will serve you as well once the evening progresses. Not everyone here shares my brother's particular interest in your family's history. She drifted away before Eleanor could respond, and Edmund leaned closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You handled that admirably. That was the easy part, Eleanor murmured. I suspect the evening has considerably harder moments still ahead. She was not wrong. As the night progressed, Eleanor found herself the subject of increasingly pointed conversation, some of it delivered directly to her face with poorly disguised cruelty, most of it whispered just loud enough to ensure she overheard it regardless. She heard her father's crime discussed as though it were the evening's chief entertainment, heard her own past poverty mocked in tones dressed up as polite concern, heard speculation about whether Edmund had simply grown bored of proper society and decided to amuse himself with something scandalous instead. Through it all, she kept her composure, drawing on years of practice concealing pain behind a steady expression, though each cruel comment landed somewhere deep and familiar, reopening wounds she had spent years learning to manage. It was Pelham himself who finally delivered the evening's sharpest blow, approaching Eleanor while Edmund had been drawn briefly into conversation with another guest across the room. "Miss Whitfield," Pelham said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I do wonder, watching you tonight, whether you fully understand what you are attempting to claim for yourself. A duke's world is not so easily entered by a woman whose own father stole silver from that very duke's household not 2 months past. Do you truly believe yourself equal to the standing you are reaching for?" The room around them had gone quiet enough that Eleanor knew every word was being carefully absorbed by everyone nearby, filed away for retelling at future gatherings for months to come. "I am not reaching for standing, Lord Pelham," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. "I never asked to be a duke's wife, nor a duke's mistress, nor anything else society might wish to speculate about. I am simply a woman who was loved once, honestly, before my own father's fear and pride destroyed that love, through a lie neither Edmund nor I ever agreed to. What happened since then is between the two of us, and frankly, none of your concern. And yet you attend my sister's gathering tonight, on the Duke's arm, for all of society to observe," Pelham said. "That rather suggests you do wish to claim some place within this world, whether you admit it plainly or not." "I attend tonight because hiding has never once solved anything for me," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly now, carrying further into the suddenly attentive room. "I hid for 6 years because I was told I was unworthy of the love I had found. I will not hide any longer simply because men like you find my presence inconvenient to the story you would rather tell about my family." A murmur rippled through the nearby guests, some clearly scandalized by her directness, others watching with the particular fascination reserved for unexpected drama. Edmund, hearing the shift in the room's energy, extracted himself quickly from his own conversation and crossed to Eleanor's side, his expression darkening as he took in Pelham's smug satisfaction. "Is there a problem here, Pelham?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying the same dangerous calm Eleanor had heard him use with the lender weeks before. "No problem at all, Ashcombe," Pelham said, though his smile suggested otherwise. "Miss Whitfield and I were simply discussing her rather unconventional claim to a place within our circles." "Miss Whitfield has made no claims tonight beyond her own honesty," Edmund said. "Which is more than I can say for the whispered speculation I have watched circulate this ballroom since the moment we arrived." The room's attention shifted fully now toward Edmund, and he seemed to recognize the opportunity this presented, straightening slightly as he addressed not only Pelham but the gathered crowd around them. "Since so many of you seem invested in the details of my private affairs," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom, "allow me to correct whatever version of events has been circulating these past weeks. 6 years ago, my family and Miss Whitfield's father conspired to separate us through deception, believing our match unsuitable for reasons that had nothing to do with either of our own wishes. I only learned the truth of that deception recently, when Miss Whitfield's father was caught attempting theft against my household, driven to desperation by debts incurred trying to survive without the support my family should have honestly extended years ago, had we not interfered so cruelly in the first place." The room absorbed this in stunned silence, the story reshaping itself in real time from scandalous gossip into something closer to genuine tragedy, one in which Eleanor was clearly the wronged party rather than the opportunistic schemer half the ballroom had assumed her to be. "Miss Whitfield's only crime," Edmund continued, "has been surviving 6 years of hardship with more grace and dignity than most of the people in this room could manage after a single difficult season. I would ask that anyone still interested in discussing my private affairs direct their questions to me directly, rather than continuing to speculate cruelly about a woman who has done nothing to deserve such treatment." Silence held for a long moment before Charlotte, of all people, stepped forward, her earlier sharpness softened into something closer to genuine embarrassment. "I did not know the full circumstances, Miss Whitfield. I apologize for my earlier comments." Others began to murmur similar sentiments, the room's mood shifting visibly from cruel curiosity toward something more sympathetic, though Eleanor knew better than to believe the shift was universal or permanent. Pelham himself said nothing further, his earlier confidence visibly deflated by Edmund's public correction of the narrative he had clearly hoped to control. Later, in the carriage returning to the estate, Eleanor finally allowed herself to exhale the tension she had carried throughout the entire evening, her hands trembling slightly now that the performance of composure was no longer required. "You did not have to defend me so publicly," she said quietly. "You have exposed your own family's failures to the entire county tonight, on my behalf. I did not do it only for your sake," Edmund said, taking her trembling hands gently in his own. "I did it because I am tired of allowing a lie my own father helped construct to continue shaping how the world sees you. You deserve the truth spoken aloud tonight, regardless of what it cost either of us in standing or reputation." Eleanor studied his face in the dim carriage light, searching for any trace of regret, and found instead only quiet resolve. "What happens now, Edmund? After tonight, there is no pretending this can remain private any longer. Now," Edmund said, "we decide together what we want the rest of this story to look like, rather than continuing to let gossip and fear write it for us." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted but strangely lighter than she had felt in years, the weight of 6 years of secrecy finally beginning to lift now that the truth, however imperfect, had finally been spoken aloud for everyone to hear. The following days brought a strange mixture of consequences neither of them had fully anticipated. Some acquaintances distanced themselves quietly, unwilling to be associated with a scandal that had so publicly implicated a duke's own late father in dishonest scheming. Others surprisingly drew closer, admiring what they described as Edmund's rare honesty and Eleanor's remarkable composure under pressure that would have broken most women born to easier circumstances. Letters arrived at the estate throughout the week, some cruel, most curious, and a few unexpectedly kind. One, from an elderly countess Eleanor had never met, expressed quiet admiration for her courage in speaking plainly at Lady Pelham's gathering, recalling her own youthful struggles against a family who had once tried to arrange her life according to their convenience rather than her happiness. Eleanor read that particular letter 3 times before setting it carefully aside, comforted by the reminder that she was not the first woman to survive such interference, nor would she be the last. Henry, watching his daughter navigate this new chapter of scrutiny from the relative safety of the estate, grew increasingly restless with his own inactivity. He had spent weeks now accepting Edmund's charity, watching his family slowly heal from wounds he himself had caused, and the guilt of remaining idle, while others cleaned up the wreckage of his choices, weighed on him more heavily with each passing day. He approached Edmund again, this time with a different request entirely. "Your Grace," Henry said, finding the Duke in his study reviewing correspondence related to the estate's spring accounts, "I have been thinking of how I might begin repaying what I owe, not simply in money, though I intend to repay that as well in time, but in honest effort. I was a capable bookkeeper once, before circumstances forced me toward more desperate measures. I wonder if there might be some position within your household where I could put that skill to honest use, rather than continuing to accept charity I have done nothing to earn." Edmund set down his correspondence and studied Henry carefully, weighing the request against 6 years of accumulated distrust. "You understand I would need to watch that work closely, at least initially." "I understand completely," Henry said. "I do not expect trust to return quickly, nor do I believe I deserve it handed to me freely. I only ask for the chance to prove, slowly, that I am capable of being something other than the man who nearly destroyed his own daughter's happiness." Edmund considered the offer for a long moment before nodding. "There is work in the estate's ledgers that my current steward struggles to keep pace with, particularly regarding the tenant accounts. I will allow you to assist with that, under his supervision, and we will see how the arrangement progresses." Henry's relief was visible, some of the perpetual tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not disappoint this chance." When Eleanor learned of the arrangement later that evening, she found herself surprised by the cautious hope it stirred in her, a feeling she had not expected to associate with her father again so soon. She did not fully trust the change in him yet, was not certain she ever fully would, but she recognized the effort for what it was, a genuine attempt to become someone worth trusting again, rather than simply asking to be trusted without earning it. "Do you think he means it?" she asked Edmund that night, as they walked together through the same garden path where they had first begun rebuilding their understanding of each other weeks before. "I do not know," Edmund admitted honestly. But I think it matters less whether I believe him fully right now, and more that he is finally attempting to act rather than simply apologize and wait for forgiveness to arrive unearned. Eleanor nodded slowly, considering this. I suppose that is all any of us can do in the end. Attempt to act honestly, and hope the people around us notice the effort, even if trust takes longer to rebuild than the actions themselves. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring air carrying the scent of new blossoms from the apple trees overhead, and Eleanor found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that the very scandal threatening to unravel everything had instead, slowly, begun to knit her fractured family back together in ways 6 years of careful hiding never could have managed. "There is something I have been wanting to ask you," Edmund said eventually, breaking the comfortable quiet between them. "What is that?" Eleanor asked, glancing up at him curiously. "Now that the truth is known, now that Pelham's threats have proven hollow, and your father is finally attempting to make amends, I find myself wondering what you want, Eleanor, not what circumstances have forced upon you, not what I want, but what you, yourself, wish for your own future." Eleanor considered the question seriously, aware of its weight, aware that for the first time in 6 years, she was genuinely being asked, rather than told, what her life should look like. "I want to stop being defined by what my father took from me," she said slowly. "I want to be known, if I am known at all, for who I choose to become from this point forward, rather than for the scandal surrounding how I arrived here. And what would that becoming look like, if you had the freedom to choose it fully?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching the moonlight filter through the bare branches above them. "I think," she said finally, "it would look like choosing you, Edmund. Not because my father arranged it, not because circumstances forced us back together, but because I have watched you these past weeks defend me, support my family, and speak honestly, even when honesty cost you dearly. I think, if I am permitted to choose freely for the first time in 6 years, I would choose exactly this." Edmund's breath caught softly at her words, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently in the cool evening air. "Then, let us choose it together, freely, without anyone else's fear or pride standing between us any longer." Eleanor smiled, the first truly unguarded smile Edmund had seen from her since their reunion began, and for a moment, standing together beneath the same apple trees where they had once believed, foolishly and briefly, that nothing could ever come between them, it felt as though 6 years had simply folded away into nothing at all. The announcement of Duke Edmund Ashworth's engagement to Miss Eleanor Whitfield arrived in the county's papers 3 weeks after Lady Pelham's gathering, and this time, when whispers followed, they carried a different weight entirely, curiosity tempered now by the public knowledge of exactly how much both parties had already survived to reach this point. Not everyone approved. Some families quietly withdrew their invitations, unwilling to associate too closely with a scandal that had touched, however tangentially, upon theft and deception. But far more families, moved by the honesty Edmund had shown at that fateful gathering, extended warmer welcomes than either Edmund or Eleanor had expected, drawn perhaps to the rare sight of a duke choosing love openly over the safer, more convenient arrangements society usually demanded of men in his position. Eleanor spent the weeks leading up to the wedding learning, slowly, how to exist within a world that had once felt entirely closed to her. She practiced the particular etiquette expected of a future duchess, though Edmund insisted repeatedly that he had no interest in molding her into someone she was not, that he had fallen in love with the woman who spoke honestly to Pelham's face in a crowded ballroom, not with some idealized version of proper society's expectations. Her mother, whose health had improved considerably once removed from the damp cottage and given proper care, was well enough by the wedding date to attend, seated in a place of honor near the front of the small chapel Edmund had chosen for the ceremony, deliberately modest rather than grand, at Eleanor's request. "I never imagined I would see this day," her mother said quietly, gripping Eleanor's hand tightly before the ceremony began. "There were years I feared you would never allow yourself happiness again, after everything your father's choices cost you." "I feared that too, for a long while," Eleanor admitted. "But I think perhaps happiness was always waiting, patiently, for me to become brave enough to reach for it again." Henry stood nearby, dressed more finely than Eleanor had seen him in years, his position within the estate's household having steadied considerably over the preceding weeks. His work in the ledgers had proven genuinely capable, earning him cautious respect from the estate's steward, and though the relationship between father and daughter remained far from fully healed, something gentler had begun growing in the space where old resentment had once lived. "I know I do not deserve to walk you toward this moment," Henry said quietly, offering his arm with visible uncertainty. But I would be honored, Margaret, if you would allow me the chance regardless. Eleanor studied her father for a long moment, 6 years of hurt and weeks of careful, hesitant rebuilding weighing against each other in her chest. Finally, she took his arm. You do not deserve it, she agreed honestly, but I find I want to allow it anyway, Father. Not because the debt between us is settled, but because I think perhaps healing sometimes means choosing grace before it is fully earned, rather than waiting for perfect deserving that may never fully arrive. Henry's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide as they walked together toward the front of the chapel, where Edmund waited, his own expression carrying none of the practiced composure he usually wore in public, replaced instead by open, unguarded joy at the sight of her approaching him. The ceremony itself was brief, simple in the way Eleanor had requested, focused less on grandeur and more on the quiet exchange of promises between two people who had already survived losing each other once and had no intention of allowing anything to separate them again. Peter stood proudly among the small gathering, no longer the wary, uncertain boy who had first arrived at the estate weeks before, but someone visibly settling into a future that finally felt secure rather than perpetually threatened. When Edmund and Eleanor exchanged their vows, both of them spoke plainly, rather than relying on the elaborate language often favored by society weddings, choosing instead words that reflected the honesty they had fought so hard to reclaim together. I promise, Edmund said, holding her hands steady in his own, to never again allow silence or assumption to stand between what I feel and what I say aloud to you. I lost you once to a lie neither of us created, and I will spend the rest of my life making certain no lie, however small, ever comes between us again. I promise, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, to keep choosing courage over hiding, honesty over silence, and you, Edmund, again and again, for as long as we both shall live, regardless of whatever else the world decides to say about either of us. The chapel erupted in quiet, genuine applause as they were pronounced husband and wife, and outside, as they emerged into the bright spring afternoon, Eleanor felt, for the first time in 6 years, entirely and completely free of the fear that had shaped every choice she had made, since that terrible letter first arrived, to shatter her world. The wedding breakfast that followed was modest by the standards of the county's grander families, held in the estate's own gardens rather than a rented hall in town, surrounded by the same apple trees where Edmund and Eleanor had first begun rebuilding their trust in each other weeks before. Lady Charlotte attended, her earlier sharpness entirely replaced now by genuine warmth, and even a few of Pelham's own circle came, drawn by curiosity that had, over the preceding weeks, gradually transformed into something closer to admiration. Pelham himself did not attend, though word reached Edmund later that afternoon that his own family's finances had come under scrutiny following quiet inquiries Edmund had authorized weeks earlier. Inquiries that revealed Pelham's own history of predatory lending arrangements, not unlike the one that had nearly destroyed Eleanor's family entirely. Edmund chose not to pursue the matter publicly, satisfied instead that Pelham's influence within the county had quietly diminished on its own, no longer strong enough to threaten anyone the way it once had threatened Eleanor at that fateful gathering. As the afternoon stretched into evening, and the gathered guests slowly began departing toward their own carriages, Eleanor found herself standing alone with Edmund, near the same low stone bench where they had first begun speaking honestly to each other weeks before, the bare branches of early spring now softened by the first small green buds of the season. "Do you remember?" Eleanor said, sitting here that first morning, uncertain whether either of us could trust what remained between us. "I remember," Edmund said. "I remember being terrified that 6 years had changed you too much, that whatever we had once shared could never fully return. And now?" Eleanor asked, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light of the day faded gently across the garden. "Now I think," Edmund said quietly, "that what we have built these past weeks is stronger than what we lost, precisely because it was built on truth rather than the easy assumptions of young love that never had to survive real hardship. We know each other now in ways we never could have, had your father's lies never separated us in the first place." Eleanor considered this, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she agreed entirely. The 6 lost years had cost them both more than either could ever fully reclaim, and yet something had grown from that loss that felt, in its own strange way, more resilient than what might have existed had they simply married young and never faced the particular trials that had eventually brought them back together. Nearby, Peter chased fireflies across the darkening lawn with the easy joy of a boy who had finally been allowed to simply be young again, unburdened by the constant worry that had shadowed his earlier years. Their mother watched from a garden chair, her health steadily improving with each week of proper rest and care, her expression carrying a peace Eleanor had not seen on her face in longer than she could remember. And Henry, standing a respectful distance away near the estate's kitchen door, watched his daughter's happiness with an expression that mixed lingering guilt with something that looked, unmistakably, like hope for the family he might yet manage to fully repair. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked softly, echoing the question she had first asked Edmund weeks before, in far more frightened circumstances. "Now," Edmund said, echoing his own earlier answer, though his voice carried none of the uncertainty it once had. "We simply live, Eleanor. Honestly, openly, together, for as long as we are given the chance to do so." Eleanor smiled, tilting her face up toward his in the fading evening light, and as their lips met in a kiss that carried none of the desperate uncertainty of stolen moments from years before, only the settled, patient joy of two people who had finally, fully found their way back to each other. The 6 years that had once stood between them dissolved entirely into nothing more than a difficult chapter in a story that had, against every obstacle placed before it, finally found its way toward a genuinely happy ending. In the weeks that followed, life at the estate settled into a rhythm neither Edmund nor Eleanor could have imagined when this story began, with silver plate clattering against cobblestones in the dark. Henry's work in the ledgers earned him, eventually, genuine trust rather than merely cautious tolerance. And though the shadow of his earlier choices never fully disappeared, it grew smaller with each passing season, overshadowed by the steady effort he continued to invest in becoming a father his daughter and son could rely upon rather than fear disappointing. Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashcombe, never forgot the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of love, and she used that memory, carefully, to extend particular kindness toward others in the county, facing hardships of their own, quietly funding assistance for families struggling beneath debts as crushing as the one that had nearly destroyed her own. She became known, eventually, not for the scandal that had once defined her arrival into society, but for a quiet, steady generosity that earned her genuine respect, far more lasting than any title alone could have provided. And Edmund, who had once believed his heart permanently closed after 6 years of grief he did not fully understand, found himself continually grateful for the strange, painful chain of events that had eventually returned Eleanor to him, understanding fully now that the 6 years they had lost had, in their own difficult way, prepared them both to build something far more honest and enduring than the young, untested love they had once shared, before either of them understood how easily happiness could be stolen, and how much courage it took to reclaim it once it was finally within reach again. Autumn arrived at the estate with a gentleness that felt, to Eleanor, entirely different from the desperate, frightened autumns of her earlier years. The apple trees along the garden path bore fruit heavier than the estate's gardener could recall in recent seasons, and Eleanor spent long afternoons there with Peter, teaching him to read the ledgers their father had once managed alone, determined that her brother would grow into a man who understood both honesty and responsibility in equal measure, rather than learning only the fear that had once driven their father toward desperate choices. Her mother's health continued its steady improvement, enough that by the first frost she was able to walk the garden paths unassisted, often pausing near the same bench where Edmund and Eleanor had first begun rebuilding their trust, remarking quietly on how strange it felt to watch her daughter's life transform so completely from the narrow, anxious existence they had once shared in the cottage past the mill. Henry, for his part, continued proving himself steadily within the estate's household, and by the time the first snow fell that winter, Edmund had extended his responsibilities to include oversight of several tenant accounts previously managed by the estate's aging steward, a role Henry approached with a diligence that surprised even those who had watched his slow transformation most closely. He never fully escaped the shadow of what he had done, and he did not ask to. Instead, he carried it quietly, using it as a reminder of exactly how much damage fear and pride could cause when left unchecked, and exactly how much patient effort was required to repair such damage once done. One evening, as winter settled fully over the estate grounds, Henry found Eleanor alone in the small parlor she had claimed as her favorite room, working through correspondence related to a charitable fund she had recently established for families facing predatory debts, similar to the one that had once nearly destroyed her own. "May I speak with you a moment, Margaret?" he asked, using the old name gently now, no longer as a demand but as an offering, one she had slowly, over the preceding months, begun allowing him to use again in private moments between them. "Of course, Father," she said, setting aside her correspondence. "I wanted to tell you," Henry said, settling into the chair across from her, "that I understand now, more fully than I did even months ago, Exactly what I took from you when I chose fear over honesty. 6 years passed. I do not say this seeking forgiveness I have not yet earned. I say it because I think you deserve to know that I have not stopped reckoning with it, nor do I intend to stop, for as long as I am given the chance to keep trying to become someone worthy of the family I nearly destroyed. Eleanor studied her father for a long moment, noting the genuine weariness in his face, the absence of the old defensive excuses that had once colored every conversation between them. I believe you, father, she said finally. And I think, perhaps, that is more than either of us expected to be true, even a few months ago. It is more than I dared hope for, Henry admitted. I know full forgiveness may take years yet, if it comes at all. But I find myself grateful simply for the chance to keep trying, rather than being shut out entirely, as I certainly deserve to be. You are still my father, Eleanor said quietly. That did not stop being true, even during the years I believed you had cost me everything worth having. I think perhaps that is why I could not fully close the door on you, even when every instinct told me I should. Henry's eyes glistened again, though this time he made no effort to blink the tears away entirely. Thank you, Margaret, for whatever grace you have managed to find for me, undeserved as it remains. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire crackling steadily in the hearth, and Eleanor found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange and unexpected the shape of healing could be, arriving not in a single dramatic moment of forgiveness, but in small, patient exchanges like this one, repeated quietly over months until trust, however cautious, began finally to take root again. Later that same winter, Edmund found Eleanor standing at the same window from which he had first watched her father drag toward the house so many months before, and he came to stand beside her, following her gaze out toward the snow-covered gardens beyond. You are thinking of that night, he said, recognizing the particular stillness in her posture. I am, Eleanor admitted. It is strange, how a single terrible evening became the beginning of everything good that followed. I do not think I will ever fully separate the fear of that night from the gratitude I feel now, looking back on everything it eventually led toward. Perhaps they were never meant to be separated, Edmund said. Perhaps the fear and the gratitude belong together, each one giving the other its proper weight and meaning. Eleanor turned to look at him, struck again, as she so often was, by how thoroughly her life had transformed since that frightened, uncertain evening. I am glad, she said softly, that whatever brought us back together, however painful the path proved to be, eventually led us here. As am I, Edmund said, drawing her close against the winter chill pressing at the window glass. Every difficult step of it, entirely worth the ending we finally found together. 2 years passed before the estate welcomed its next chapter, and it arrived not with scandal or fear, but with the quiet, ordinary joy of a nursery being prepared at the top of the east staircase, sunlight pouring through windows Eleanor had chosen herself, facing the same apple trees where she and Edmund had first learned to trust each other again. Their daughter arrived on a bright morning in early summer, and Edmund, who had once believed himself incapable of feeling anything as complete as the love he now carried for both his wife and his newborn child, found himself standing at the nursery window long after the household had settled into sleep, simply watching her small chest rise and fall, marveling at the strange, patient path that had led him here. They named her Grace, a choice Eleanor had insisted upon quietly, without needing to explain her reasoning to anyone who had witnessed the past 2 years unfold. It was, she said, the single word that best captured everything that had carried her family from ruin back toward wholeness. The grace Edmund had shown her father, the grace she had slowly learned to extend in return, and the grace that had, against every obstacle placed before it, allowed love to survive 6 years of separation and rebuild itself into something stronger than it had ever been before. Henry doted on his granddaughter with a tenderness that surprised even Eleanor, who had spent years believing her father incapable of such uncomplicated affection. He visited the nursery daily, often reading quietly to Grace from books he had once read to Eleanor herself as a small child, before debt and fear had reshaped him into someone harder, someone willing to sacrifice his own daughter's happiness, rather than face the consequences of his failures honestly. That man, Eleanor reflected often during those visits, felt increasingly like a stranger compared to the steady, remorseful father who now sat patiently beside Grace's cradle each evening. Peter, now 17 and preparing to begin formal studies that Edmund had generously arranged to support, had grown into a thoughtful young man who carried none of the anxious wariness that had defined his arrival at the estate years before. He often spoke of wanting, eventually, to study law, drawn by a desire to help other families avoid the kind of predatory debt that had once nearly destroyed his own. Edmund supported the ambition wholeheartedly, recognizing in Peter's determination the same quiet strength that had carried Eleanor through her hardest years. The charitable fund Eleanor had established continued growing steadily, eventually expanding beyond the county's borders as word spread of a duchess who understood, personally and painfully, exactly what predatory lenders could do to desperate families. She worked closely with local magistrates to establish fairer lending practices throughout the region, and though the work was slow and often frustrating, she found deep satisfaction in knowing that fewer families would face the same impossible choices her own father had once faced. Fewer daughters would grow up believing themselves unworthy of love because of decisions entirely outside their control. Lord Pelham's influence, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. The scrutiny Edmund had authorized following that fateful gathering eventually revealed enough evidence of unfair lending practices connected to Pelham's own family holdings that several prominent families quietly withdrew their association with him. He remained within county society, technically, but his voice carried little of the sharp authority it once had, and Eleanor found she felt no particular satisfaction in his diminishment, only a quiet relief that his particular brand of cruelty no longer held power over families as vulnerable as hers had once been. Lady Charlotte, surprisingly, became one of Eleanor's closest friends within county society, the two women bonding over their shared experience of being underestimated by men who believed confidence and cleverness belonged exclusively to those born into unquestioned privilege. Charlotte often visited the estate, and it was not uncommon, during those visits, to find her seated in the nursery alongside Eleanor, both women laughing over some small, ordinary joy that neither could have imagined sharing together during that first tense encounter at her brother's gathering years before. On the second anniversary of their wedding, Edmund surprised Eleanor with a quiet dinner in the garden itself, set beneath the same apple trees that had witnessed so much of their story unfold, now heavy with early summer blossom. Grace slept peacefully in her nurse's care nearby, and as the evening light softened into gold across the estate grounds, Edmund reached for Eleanor's hand across the small table, much as he had reached for it that first uncertain morning years before. "Do you remember," he said, "when you told me you did not know how to trust what remained between us?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory now rather than flinching from it. "I remember being terrified that trusting you again would only lead to another kind of loss." "And now?" Edmund asked, echoing the question that had become, over the years, something of a quiet ritual between them, a way of measuring how far they had traveled from that frightened beginning. "Now," Eleanor said, "I think trust was always the right choice, even when it felt impossible. I think perhaps the 6 years we lost taught us both something we might never have learned otherwise: patience, honesty, the particular courage required to choose love again after believing it had been stolen from us entirely." Edmund lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the same gesture he had offered on their wedding day, though it carried now the settled weight of years spent proving that promise true, day after ordinary day, rather than the untested hope of a single ceremony. "I used to believe," he said quietly, "that the 6 years we lost were simply years stolen from us, time we could never reclaim no matter how much happiness followed. I do not believe that any longer. I think those years, painful as they were, became the foundation for everything we have built since, a foundation neither of us would trade now, even if it meant erasing the suffering that shaped it." Eleanor considered this, watching the last light of evening settle golden across the garden where their story had first begun to heal, and found, to her quiet contentment, that she agreed completely. The theft that had once threatened to destroy everything, her father's desperate crime born from 6 years of carefully constructed lies, had instead become the unlikely beginning of a story, far richer than the one those lies had originally stolen from her. Somewhere in the house behind them, Henry sat with a book of poetry Eleanor had once loved as a girl, preparing to read aloud to his granddaughter once she woke from her afternoon rest, a small, steady act of devotion that would have seemed impossible to imagine, years before, from the man who had once sold his daughter's happiness for a price that nearly cost them everything. And in the garden, beneath the apple trees where fear had first begun, slowly and patiently, transforming into trust, Edmund and Eleanor sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky deepen toward evening, secure at last in a love that had survived theft, scandal, and 6 long years of separation, emerging on the other side not diminished, but immeasurably, permanently stronger for everything it had been forced to overcome. A soft cry drifted from the nursery window above, and Eleanor rose without hesitation, years of instinct already guiding her feet toward the sound before the nurse could even call down to them. Edmund followed close behind, and together they climbed the familiar staircase, past portraits of Ashcombe ancestors who had never known a story quite like theirs, toward the small room where their daughter waited, her tiny fists curled against the evening air. Eleanor lifted Grace gently from her cradle, murmuring soft, wordless comfort, until the crying quieted into the small, contented sounds of a child settling back toward sleep, and Edmund watched them both from the doorway, with an expression he no longer bothered to hide, the open, unguarded devotion of a man who had spent 6 years believing such simple happiness had been permanently closed to him. "She has your eyes," Edmund said quietly, moving to stand beside them. "She has your patience," Eleanor countered, smiling as Grace's small fingers curled instinctively around her own. "Though I suppose we will not know for certain what she has inherited from either of us until she is old enough to argue about it herself." "I look forward to that particular battle," Edmund said, laughing softly, and Eleanor found herself laughing too, struck again by how ordinary, how blessedly unremarkable such small moments had become, after years spent believing herself entitled to nothing beyond mere survival. They stood together for a long while, watching their daughter drift back toward sleep, and Eleanor found her thoughts drifting, as they often did during such quiet moments, toward the frightened young woman who had once opened a cottage door to find a duke standing on the other side, uncertain whether the man before her carried rescue or ruin. She could not have imagined, that terrifying night, the particular shape her life would eventually take, the daughter, sleeping now in her arms, the father slowly rebuilding himself downstairs, the husband beside her who had chosen honesty again and again, even when honesty cost him dearly. "I want her to grow up knowing this story," Eleanor said softly, still watching Grace sleep. "Not the frightening parts, not yet, but eventually. I want her to understand that love survived something that could have destroyed it entirely, because two people chose honesty over fear, even when fear would have been so much easier. She will know it," Edmund promised, "every part of it, when she is old enough to understand its full weight. I think it is a story worth remembering, not because of the pain it contains, but because of what that pain eventually became." Eleanor looked up at him, her husband, her partner, in a story neither of them had chosen but both had ultimately shaped into something worth treasuring, and felt, once again, the same quiet gratitude that had settled into her chest so many months before, in this very house, when trust had first begun rebuilding itself between them. "Thank you," she said simply, "for waiting. All those years, even when you did not fully understand what you were waiting for." "Thank you," Edmund replied, "for choosing to trust again, when trust must have felt like the most dangerous choice available to you." Downstairs, faint and steady, they could hear Henry's voice beginning the familiar rhythm of an old poem, practicing for when Grace would wake again and want to hear it properly, and the sound carried up through the quiet house like a small, ongoing promise that healing, however slow and imperfect, remained steadily, faithfully underway. Outside, the last light of evening finally faded fully into night, and the apple trees stood dark and patient in the garden below, silent witnesses to everything that had grown, against every early fear, from the ground where their story had first, so carefully and so bravely, begun again.